Fiona Hill's There's Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century is a book dedicated to presenting an analysis of attitudes in impoverished communities that Hill argues leads to authoritarian regimes. She uses her Russian credentials to make this argument while insisting that the US is becoming more and more like Russia. While she makes comparisons between Trump and Putin, she chiefly writes using her own hometown, Bishop Auckland in northern England, as a frame of reference. Her argument is that authoritarian regimes often take advantage of poor, underprivileged people who are desperate. When figures like Putin, Nigel Farage, or Trump come on the stage and claim they're going to give the country back to the people, the impoverished people are the ones most ready to believe them. When Trump ran in 2016 and said he was going to drain the swamp, it was impoverished communities that felt left behind that believed Trump. However, if anyone were to criticize Fiona Hill as being overly critical or prejudiced towards American society, they would find that most of the things that she claims are true about the US, she also claims are true about Russian and English society as well. Just like Trump, when Nigel Farage said Brexit would liberate the British people from Europe, there were similar groups who believed Nigel Farage. And the same phenomenon can be observed in Russia leading Putin's And the same phenomenon can be observed in Russia leading to Putin's rise in authority. If this sounds prejudiced, the problem is not so much that these groups are intrinsically or inherently gullible, but that impoverished conditions lead to a kind of desperation. In regards to her own upbringing, she spends perhaps the first half of her book describing the difficult conditions in which she was raised. In Bishop Auckland, she did not have a car, TV, or new clothes, and occasionally she had to wait in food lines for a meal. For work, she routinely had to ride her bike a great distance, and locally she could only get menial low-wage labor. Her father even more so risked losing his job since the coal industry was being rather volatile. And as a result of the rough conditions she describes, she mentions that many of her fellow Brits from towns like Bishop Auckland, felt trapped and were ready to believe that Brexit would fix their problems. According to Hill, this thought process wasn't so much based in fact. Them leaving the EU meant that they would lose grant opportunities coming from the EU, but the people in her community were desperate enough that they were ready to believe just about anything. When Fiona Hill eventually traveled to the US and Russia, she said she noticed many towns and communities with the same sorts of conditions. In Russia, towns in the northern area were once industrial centers for the USSR. These towns have since been left behind after the collapse of the USSR. In the US, Michigan was once an industrial hub as well as the entire Rust Belt. Bishop Auckland similarly was also previously an industrial coal area. All these communities share a sense that they were left behind, and in Fiona Hill's observations, this manifests itself in some rather destructive ways. For example, in the former USSR, they couldn't always afford alcohol, but they would still try to find less safe ways of getting drunk because their conditions were that desperate. Similarly, in Bishop Auckland, she claims they couldn't afford illegal substances, but they would try to use regular household substances to get a fix as an even more dangerous substitute. The point is, rough conditions lead to people doing desperate things, which is where authoritarianism comes into play. Figures like Trump and Putin both present themselves as men for the people. Putin, for instance, visits industrial towns and often likes to pose next to men wearing hard hats. Well, Trump also uses mannerisms that show solidarity with the common people. For instance, he doesn't like fancy food, but prefers fast food and other forms of common entertainment. While Putin presents himself as a tough guy who is tough on oligarchs, Trump presents himself as a tough guy who's tough on the deep state. Both, according to Hill, are autocrats who try to use their cult of personality to maintain their control of their respective countries. Neither tolerates opposition and will use lawyers, courts, and really any means at their disposal to go after their opposition. Both will use their supporters to rally around them as figureheads. Her answer to this problem is for countries to embrace education and focus more on upward mobility, that is, upward socio-economic mobility. She mentions that the success in her own upbringing were rather exceptional in that she was able to move out of her immediate circumstances due to luck and adaptability. If communities have opportunities to succeed, however, people are less likely to need to look externally for hope. Her solution is to try to break down the social barriers and create clubs, communities, and various connections for impoverished communities that in exchange can allow for others to get educated and get ahead just like she did. While she discusses the convoluted issues that impoverished communities face, for the most part her solutions are not particularly novel. Mainly, she just seems to believe that governments should try to promote more opportunities for their people. This includes scholarships, bus routes, training programs, and community outreach. Investing in the communities is likely to produce greater job opportunities and ultimately lead to greater prosperity for the country, which in return eliminates the appeal of autocrats. For the purpose of understanding Russia and autocratic regimes, I'm not sure I recommend this book. Bishop Auckland to Russian villages may be relevant. Like her comparison of Bishop Auckland to Russian villages may be relevant, or it might be off base, but in either case, it doesn't seem to account for the whole picture. Russia in 1991 was collectively poor, with numerous cities becoming obsolete. This was due to an entire system of government made worse by a sudden switch. Bishop Auckland in the UK, or the Rust Belt in the US, contrarily really only represent one segment of a society. So Bishop Auckland in the UK or the Rust Belt in the US only really represent one part of society and don't reflect the country's overall well-being. While she mentions her success was exceptional, not the norm in Bishop Auckland, in the USSR, one could probably conclude that such an advancement would be nearly impossible, since it wasn't just difficult to get ahead, but in some cases it wasn't even an option. From interviews and elsewhere, Fiona Hill does seem to have some rather keen insights into how Putin thinks, and her first-hand experience of Russian society helps her assessment. I suppose this is why she wrote another book entitled Mr. Putin. The central focus of this book, however, There's Nothing for You Here, doesn't seem to be Russia or even the US. Rather, it's just a manifesto for greater socio-economic mobility. Fiona Hill is obviously passionate about the subject as she experienced the hardships of growing up poor in northern England. She doesn't believe in what she calls the myth of individualism, where hard work alone is enough to get you ahead. She knows what it means for a community to be left behind and believes these problems can be fixed with more interconnectivity. Incidentally, she also believes this will solve the problems of authoritarianism. As for my part, I don't know if I agree with all her points. I do think she is a bit biased in her assessment of Trump, and I think ultimately people are persuaded by authoritarianism for different reasons than the ones she describes. In regards to Trump, she concludes that Trump tried to orchestrate a coup on January 6, 2021. She also interprets his comments to Bob Woodward, saying he gets along well with dictators, as an endorsement for their ideology. While Trump might be a dictator or an autocrat, I find these particular examples to be dubious or at least open to interpretation. Simply saying it's good you get along with Kim Jong-un is not the same thing as endorsing his regime in North Korea. And Trump did make comments on January 6 discouraging the rioters from attacking the Capitol. Perhaps he didn't actually mean it when he said the rioters should go home or be peaceful, but at no point did he actually tell them to occupy militarily the Capitol. Anyway, even if Fiona Hill is fundamentally correct, I think an alternative view is worth considering or at least addressing, as there is more to the January 6th event than she describes. As for poverty being the reason people embrace authoritarianism, I suppose these conditions can lead to people being persuaded, but in the case of Trump and Putin, they both managed to win multiple elections. Are the mentioned impoverished communities so foolish as to think that a second term will improve their conditions after a first term failed to do so? I don't personally think so. Most people know they're not going to suddenly become rich because they voted for a particular candidate. Rather, when given only two options to choose from, the reason people choose one candidate over another doesn't have to be particularly deep or niche. It could be they genuinely didn't like some of Joe Biden's policies, take your pick, Or it could be that there was something desirable about Trump that persuaded them to vote for him. Whether you agree with the decision or not, presumably he won the primary and the popular vote for a reason. And I don't think that reason is because the communities thought he had superpowers that would miraculously bring their impoverished communities to fame and glory. It could be that they felt Joe Biden was too old, or it could be Kamala Harris was too much of an enigma. Doesn't really matter. The point is they had a reason. Anne Applebaum, who wrote a book called The Twilight of Democracy, which I previously covered, makes many of the same claims about authoritarianism as Fiona Hill. They both seem to agree on who is and who is not an authoritarian, but on this particular point concerning the role of poverty in such regimes, Applebaum's opinion definitely deviates from Hill's. Applebaum notes that many of the autocratic rulers and their supporters are not actually poor and uneducated. Rather, many of them are quite privileged, but simply persuaded by the various autocratic narratives. I think I agree with Applebaum more on this point. The allure of 1930s Germany didn't only appeal to the impoverished, while the majority of communist revolutionaries, such as Lenin, actually had middle-class backgrounds. Just because someone claims to speak for the poor doesn't mean the poor support them. And if the poor do support them, it doesn't mean they believe everything they say. Where I definitely agree with Fiona Hill is that I think her assessment of Trump as a liability is correct. While I suppose she might be correct in her assessment of him being dangerously vindictive, I agree with her mainly based on his impatient temperament. She mentions that he didn't pay attention to the details or listen to the experts, but instead would take what dictators said at face value. He was so dismissive of intelligence agencies that he even shoved briefing notes in his pockets. Trump wouldn't give Fiona Hill a chance to clarify things about Putin during press meetings, despite her having studied Putin for years. Rather, Trump's circle was mostly concerned with what his supporters believed. More information reached Trump via Fox News than the National Security Committee, which Fiona Hill was a part of. With all the speculation surrounding Trump and Russia collusion at the time when Fiona Hill wrote this book, Fiona Hill concluded from the Helsinki Accords that Trump wasn't really serving Russia's interest, but was really only interested in himself. While he praised autocrats, this has more to do with his own ego. Because he sees them as powerful rulers, he considers their opinions to be authoritative. Putin or Viktor Orban's opinion mattered more to Trump than Fiona Hill's opinion because their power appealed to Trump. This left him open to some cognitive distortions. Now, it's possible Fiona Hill was jealous since her professional skills were ignored. She laments periodically throughout the book about how her being a woman led to her being ignored, and being part of Trump's security team was the ultimate challenge of such. It's also perhaps worth noting that people didn't elect Fiona Hill, but they elected Donald Trump, in which case the National Security Committee needs to understand that democracy doesn't necessarily need to answer to their professional expertise. There's a genuine fear that the deep state has too much influence over the policy of elected officials. But with all this considered, this does not make Fiona Hill wrong. Most people who observe Trump's manner of doing business or politics notice that it is largely impulsive and tends to skip details. For example, I personally noticed this pattern in the way Trump attempted to negotiate an end to Russia's war in Ukraine. Because he paid attention to what Putin and Fox News hosts said and ignored the details, this led to him thinking the war was as simple as just making Ukraine give up the Donbass. Newsflash, it's not. Putin has maximalist demands that would cripple Ukraine's defense, and people knew this before Zelensky's Oval Office meeting, and they knew it before Putin's Alaska meeting. The reality is Ukraine needs actual security wherever you draw its borders, and there's no good reason for them to concede land in exchange for rhetorical security guarantees. Now, I knew this by looking at the Istanbul talks and by observing Putin's demands at the start of the war, but Trump apparently didn't look closely at these details, nor did he listen to those who knew them. His understanding of the events mirrors someone who heard talk show hosts discuss the matter. But it doesn't mirror somebody who had strategic experts as his advisors. That said, though, I also agree with Fiona Hill that Trump doesn't appear to be a definitive Russian asset. Since the full-scale invasion, while it's true we've seen Trump make several decisions that don't fully support Ukraine, many of these decisions also don't fully benefit Russia either. Pearl, the Prioritize Ukraine requirement list that has Europeans buying American weapons for Ukraine, seems to be a good example of such a decision. This doesn't benefit Russia, obviously, since it allows Ukraine to buy American weapons, but it was definitely a step back from the support Biden provided. Trump has no qualms with the U.S. being one of the only countries to vote against Ukraine in the UN resolution. Meanwhile, Trump and Steve Witkoff also have clear financial interest in Russia, but the U.S. still has no problem placing sanctions on Russia, albeit they did unfortunately lift them during the Iran war. In any case, it's apparent Trump's presidency is a bit of a mixed bag in contrast to committed liberal institutionalists, non-interventionists, and realists. I enjoyed reading Fiona Hill's book. She provides a very interesting look into how societies work and how people go from poverty to success. She makes some connections that are quite thoughtful, but in some ways I don't feel as though the connections are as strong as she would like them to be. Just my opinion. In a way, I think we are left with 3 books. The first book is about life growing up in Bishop Auckland. The second is about Putin and Trump and how similar they are. And the third book is a manifesto about difficulties preventing people from achieving upward socio-economic mobility. While she connects all 3 of these ideas, it does feel as though there's a leap in theme. From the start of the book, you can sense there's something particular about her argumentation. She focuses on mobility for impoverished people and income inequality and sexism in the political sphere, which are genuine topics that people discuss on a serious level, but not necessarily in relation to Russia's autocracy or other autocracies. While I don't agree with everything she says, though, on everything she applies, she does offer quite a lot to consider. For those who want to hear an overview of how economic burdens are part of authoritarian regimes, then her book is a must-read, and I would recommend it on those terms. In any case, if you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any recommendations, feel free to comment. Thank you.